Some men don't leave because their feelings faded. They leave because what they felt grew bigger than anything they knew how to handle. So tonight, listen closely, because a man who truly loves you will sometimes pull away for one specific reason, a reason so quiet, so deeply hidden that most people move through their entire lives without ever recognizing it. It doesn't announce itself with dramatic words or unmistakable signs. It lives beneath ordinary moments, concealed beneath everyday conversations, polite smiles, and routines that appear perfectly normal from the outside. Yet despite its silence, it has the power to alter the direction of relationships in ways that leave both people searching for explanations that never quite satisfy. You might already know this feeling. That sudden chill that seems to appear without warning. The unexplainable distance that slowly stretches between you and someone whose eyes once rested on you with unmistakable warmth. Someone who once seemed fully present now feels as though part of them has quietly drifted somewhere beyond your reach. The conversations still happen, but they feel different. The laughter sounds familiar, yet somehow lighter, as though something essential has been left unsaid. The connection hasn't disappeared overnight, but its rhythm has changed in a way neither of you can easily explain. At first, the mind searches for obvious answers. Maybe it was something you said. Maybe it was an argument that seemed insignificant at the time. Maybe life simply became too busy. We naturally look for visible causes because visible causes are comforting. They suggest that if we can identify the mistake, we can repair the damage. But the deepest shifts in human connection rarely begin with a single event. More often, they begin beneath awareness, where emotions evolve long before words are able to describe them. There are battles that unfold entirely within a person's inner world. Conflicts between hope and fear, between the longing to be understood and the instinct to remain guarded, between the desire for closeness and the anxiety that closeness may eventually lead to disappointment. These conflicts are rarely visible, yet they quietly influence every interaction, every hesitation, every moment of emotional withdrawal. A man's heart is often far more complex than his silence suggests. Many are taught from an early age to carry uncertainty privately, to solve emotional problems internally, and to mistake vulnerability for weakness. As a result, when confusion or emotional pain begins to grow, it is often hidden behind composure instead of expressed through conversation. What appears to others as emotional distance may actually be an internal struggle that has been unfolding quietly for much longer than anyone realizes. This is why some of the greatest misunderstandings in relationships are born not from a lack of love, but from a lack of visible language for what is happening beneath the surface. One person notices distance and assumes affection has faded. The other is silently wrestling with emotions they cannot fully explain, hoping the confusion will pass before anyone notices. Both care. Both hurt. Yet each interprets the silence through a completely different story. Keep listening, because what comes next may reshape the way you think about love, about emotional pain, and about the hidden currents that move through a man's heart. Sometimes what changes a relationship is not the absence of feeling, but the presence of fears that were never spoken aloud. Sometimes the greatest obstacle is not that love has disappeared, but that it has collided with old wounds, quiet insecurities, and deeply rooted beliefs that have remained invisible for years. When you begin to understand those invisible forces, many moments that once seemed confusing start to make sense. The mixed signals, the unexpected withdrawal, the hesitation after intimacy, the silence that follows moments of genuine closeness. None of these automatically mean that love is gone. Often, they are the outward expressions of an inward conflict, where the desire to move closer exists alongside an equally powerful instinct to protect oneself from the possibility of loss. That understanding does not erase pain, nor does it excuse unhealthy behavior, but it does replace confusion with clarity. It reminds us that beneath many moments of distance lies a story that was unfolding long before the relationship began, a story written by past experiences, quiet disappointments, and emotional patterns that continue shaping the present until someone finally learns to recognize them. There's a version of love that refuses to sit still, a love so overwhelming it rattles the very core of who a man believes himself to be. Most of us grow up assuming that love naturally draws two people closer and closer together. But if you look deeper into human psychology, you find something far more complicated. Sometimes the most powerful kind of love pushes people apart before it ever pulls them together. Sometimes a man goes quiet, not because he cares less, but because he suddenly cares more than he knows what to do with. Carl Jung talked about something he called the shadow, that concealed part of a person's psyche where fear, insecurity, old wounds, and buried truths all live. And when a man falls for someone on a soul level, not just because she's attractive, not just because of chemistry, but because he genuinely loves who she is underneath everything, that shadow starts to stir. All at once, he's not battling the outside world anymore. He's battling himself. Here's the thing. Most men grow up learning how to survive, not how to actually feel. From boyhood, so many are taught that showing emotion is a weakness, that being vulnerable is risky, and that attachment means losing your grip. So when real love shows up in his life, it doesn't just warm his heart. It cracks open every wound he spent years burying under silence. A woman might assume he pulled back because his interest faded. But often, the real story is much harder to accept. He got distant because being close to her made him feel more than he could comfortably carry. And that single trait responsible for this pulling away. It's emotional intensity, not her looks, not what she says, not even the relationship itself. It's the sheer force of what he feels when he's near her that scares him more than he could ever put into words. A man who loves someone this deeply usually isn't scared of losing her. He's scared of losing himself in the feelings she stirs up inside him. Some people walk into your life and simply make you feel steady, comfortable, safe in an ordinary sort of way. But every once in a while, someone comes along who reaches parts of you that you'd spent years keeping hidden from everyone, without even trying to. And when a man runs into a connection like that, something shifts inside him. His mind gets noisier, his fears sharpen, his longing becomes almost impossible to sit with. Every message suddenly matters. Every quiet moment feels loaded. Every chance of being turned away feels like it could destroy him. So rather than leaning in, he starts backing away. And here's the tragedy of it. So many women read that retreat as him not caring, when really it's the opposite. It's emotional overload. A man who feels nothing can stay light and easy. He can flirt freely, speak without his voice shaking. But a man who's genuinely deeply in love becomes exposed in a way that terrifies him because he's spent his whole life keeping his emotional world locked behind walls nobody else could even see. That's the real reason some men turn cold right after falling hard for someone. It's not that the fire went out, it's that the fire got too big to manage, so he starts overanalyzing every interaction. He picks apart every sentence. He worries about saying too much, feeling too much, needing too much. And little by little, without even meaning to, he starts putting up distance as a way to protect himself emotionally. There's a strange, painful irony buried in the way men experience love. The deeper he falls, the more exposed he becomes to potential pain. And vulnerability isn't something most men are ever taught how to sit with. Society praises strength, logic, fearlessness in men. But nobody sits a boy down and teaches him what to do when his whole sense of peace suddenly depends on someone else being there. Nobody prepares him for love that keeps him staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m. Nobody teaches him how to survive the fear of losing someone who's become sacred to him. So he retreats into silence and distance because that distance feels a lot safer than standing fully exposed. Sometimes a man vanishes for days, and it's got nothing to do with you mattering less. It's because he's trying to wrestle back some control over feelings that have gotten too big for him. He sits by himself, replaying every conversation in his head. He can't figure out why your absence hits him so hard. He wonders how your voice can soothe him and wreck him in the very same breath. And the closer he feels to you, the more unsettled he becomes by how much he's come to depend on that closeness. This is exactly why intense love so often brings confusion before it brings clarity. His soul recognizes the connection instantly, but his ego panics because it senses this kind of love has the power to change everything. A lot of men carry old betrayals, abandonment, humiliation, or emotional neglect from long before they ever met the woman they love now. Those wounds don't just vanish because love finally arrives. In fact, real love has a way of stirring up pain that's been sitting dormant for years. When someone starts to matter that much, every old scar wakes back up. The fear of being rejected grows louder. The fear of not measuring up gets sharper. The human mind works in strange ways. We often flee from the very thing we want most. Jung believed that whatever we push away internally ends up quietly running our lives from the shadows. And for a lot of men, deep love sets off internal battles they never saw coming. On the outside, they might look completely calm, while chaos is tearing through them on the inside. A man can seem emotionally checked out while he's secretly thinking about the same woman every single night before he falls asleep. He can act distant while carrying an attachment so strong it's shaping his whole inner world. That gap between what's happening inside him and what shows on the outside is exactly what confuses so many relationships. What makes it even harder is that some men genuinely convince themselves that pulling away is a form of protection for her. They tell themselves they're shielding her from their confusion, their instability, their unresolved baggage. They're afraid of becoming toxic, afraid of letting her down, afraid they won't live up to whatever love is supposed to demand of them. So they retreat, hoping the silence will somehow make the feelings more manageable. But emotions that get buried alive never really go away. They just grow heavier in the dark. And eventually, the distance itself starts to hurt. There's something almost spiritual about being loved deeply by someone who can't fully put it into words. Their silence holds storms you can't see. Their eyes give away feelings their mouths are too afraid to admit. Sometimes they look at you like they've finally found home in your presence, and then, moments later, they retreat into themselves completely. If you don't understand what's happening, this can feel incredibly cruel. But most of the time, it isn't cruelty at all. It's emotional survival. A man who's never learned how to manage that kind of intensity will instinctively put up distance the second love starts to feel like too much. And the saddest part of all this is that relationships don't usually end because the love disappeared. They end because fear grew louder than communication. Two people can genuinely love each other and still completely misread one another. One reads silence as rejection. The other uses silence as a shield. One is craving reassurance. The other is hiding out of fear. And slowly, the connection gets buried under pride, anxiety, old trauma, and things that never got said out loud. This is exactly why emotional maturity matters even more than passion. Passion without emotional awareness can quietly destroy itself. Here's something important to understand about men who feel things intensely. Their love is almost never shallow. When they care with everything they've got. But because their emotions run so deep, they're often more afraid of loss than most people realize. They may look distant on the surface while being deeply attached underneath. They might avoid vulnerability outwardly while quietly craving closeness every single day. The issue was never that he doesn't feel things. The issue is that he doesn't know how to regulate feelings that big without getting completely overwhelmed by them. A man who loves deeply tends to study the woman he loves in silence. He picks up on the tiniest shift in her mood. He remembers small details she probably forgot she'd even mentioned. He carries her presence with him into the most ordinary parts of his day, even if nobody around him would ever know it. Certain songs remind him of her. Quiet, empty nights remind him of her. Even his own success starts to feel hollow without her in it. Even his silence is filled with thoughts of her. But because that intensity scares him, he hides all of it behind a wall of distance. He's afraid that if he lets the depth of his attachment show, he'll lose all control over himself. And maybe that's the deepest truth buried in all of this. Real love changes a person on a psychological level. It's not just romance, it's transformation. It drags hidden wounds to the surface. It exposes insecurities you've spent years denying. It challenges every illusion the ego built around being self-sufficient. And a lot of people are completely unprepared for what that kind of emotional consequence feels like. They go in expecting butterflies, excitement, passion. They don't expect an identity crisis, deep fear, a kind of spiritual awakening, and the raw vulnerability that real connection actually demands. Sometimes the strongest men fall apart emotionally in the presence of genuine love. Not because they're weak, but because real intimacy strips away every layer of armor they've built. And underneath all that armor is just a human being who wants more than anything to be understood without being judged for it. So many men were never taught how to voice emotional overwhelm in a healthy way. Instead of saying, "I love you so much it scares me," they just go quiet. Instead of admitting, "I'm terrified of losing you," they act like they've checked out. Instead of confessing, "You mean more to me than I know how to say," they disappear into silence. If you've ever loved a man like this, you already know how much it can hurt. One moment, you feel completely connected to his soul, and the next, he feels like he's 1,000 miles away. His inconsistency creates a strange kind of confusion, because his energy is saying one thing while his behavior is saying something entirely different. But people are complicated. We're not always emotionally in sync with our own actions. Trauma, fear, shame, insecurity, and old pain all warp the way people show love. Some people chase love hard, others run from it instinctively. Both reactions come from the exact same place: fear. And fear is powerful enough to convince a man that distance equals safety, that shutting down protects him from heartbreak, that silence keeps words he's terrified to say locked away where they can't hurt him. But fear also breeds loneliness, because the human soul was never built to survive permanently cut off from real emotional closeness. Deep down, every person just wants to be seen, understood, and loved without needing to hide behind some emotional mask. There are nights when a man who loves deeply sits by himself with thoughts he can't even explain to another soul. He thinks about your laugh, your energy, the way just being around you changed the whole feel of a room. He replays the same conversations over and over, wondering if he should reach out or keep pretending none of it affects him. His pride tells him to stay distant. His heart is begging him to come back. And inside that quiet war, he's suffering more than most people would ever guess, because suppressing an emotion doesn't kill it. It just traps it inside him, where it slowly turns into anxiety, restlessness, regret, and exhaustion. A lot of emotionally distant men aren't actually empty inside. They're overloaded. And that's a very different thing. Someone who feels nothing is emotionally empty. Someone who feels far too much and has no idea how to process it safely is emotionally overloaded. And when a person doesn't have the tools to deal with that, distance becomes the default coping mechanism. He's not disappearing because love died. He's disappearing because that love triggered fears he never actually healed from. This is exactly why emotional intelligence matters so much when it comes to real personal growth. Without self-awareness, love turns chaotic. Without honesty about your emotions, relationships turn confusing. Without healing, people end up projecting old wounds onto brand new connections. A man who hasn't confronted his own fears might unintentionally sabotage the very relationship his soul actually wants most, not because he's trying to hurt the woman he loves, but because he's unconsciously trying to protect himself from some imagined disaster. And yet, even with all this pain, there's still something beautiful buried inside intense love like this, because it proves the soul is still alive. It proves connection still has the power to move a person beyond pure logic. In a world where so many relationships have gone shallow, transactional, emotionally flat, a love this deep is still sacred. Terrifying, sure. Complicated, absolutely. But still sacred. Because when someone reaches your soul deeply enough to stir up both love and fear at the same time, it means that connection went far beyond anything ordinary. The real danger comes when people completely misunderstand this whole process. So many women spend years blaming themselves for a man's emotional distance, convinced they weren't pretty enough, lovable enough, or worthy enough. But usually, that distance has almost nothing to do with what they're worth. Sometimes a woman simply stirs up feelings so intense the man had no idea how to hold them. And instead of learning to work through that intensity like an adult, he ran from it. That doesn't mean emotional distance should always just be excused. Real love still needs communication, effort, accountability, and presence. Pain is never a valid excuse for hurtful behavior, but understanding the psychology behind why men withdraw can help us look at people with a little more compassion. Not everyone who pulls away is heartless. Some are just wounded people struggling with a depth of emotion they were never taught how to handle. There's a kind of spiritual loneliness in a lot of men that society barely ever talks about. One built from years of suppressing how they feel. So many were raised to provide, achieve, compete, and survive, but nobody ever taught them how to be vulnerable without shame. So when real love finally shows up, it crashes head-on into years of that conditioning. Part of him wants to fully surrender to the connection. Another part is fighting hard to keep control. And that internal tug-of-war is often exactly what creates the confusing distance in a relationship. You might notice that men who love deeply often watch from a distance, even after things end. They stay emotionally tied to you even after the physical connection breaks. They quietly check to see if you're okay. They think about reaching back out more often than you'd ever guess. Because a real emotional bond doesn't just fade away easily. The soul holds on to what the mind tries to bury. Real connection leaves a kind of psychological imprint that lingers long after the physical distance sets in. But here's the deeper lesson buried under all of this. Love by itself isn't enough if fear is the one calling the shots. Emotional depth without emotional courage just turns into self-sabotage. Eventually, a man has to decide whether he's going to keep hiding behind fear or grow into the kind of emotional maturity that real intimacy actually requires. Because love can't survive forever inside silence. At some point, the truth has to come out. Vulnerability has to be allowed in. The walls have to come down. Otherwise, even the deepest connection slowly suffocates under everything that never got said. And maybe you, listening to this right now, have spent nights wondering why someone who clearly cared about you turned distant. Maybe his eyes loved you while his actions left you confused. Maybe his silence hurt more than outright rejection ever could. But understand this, people show you how emotionally healed they are by how they handle love. Some run, some fight, some talk it through, some vanish. And every one of those responses tells a story about the battles happening inside them. A man who's done his healing doesn't fear emotional closeness. He understands that being vulnerable isn't weakness, it's courage. He communicates instead of withdrawing. He stays present instead of hiding behind silence. But a man who's still wounded often mistakes emotional intensity for danger. The deeper he feels, the more threatened he becomes by his own vulnerability. And until he faces those fears head-on, he'll likely keep repeating the same pattern of distance, even with the people he loves the most. Life has a strange way of putting us in front of connections that expose our deepest truths. Some people don't come into our lives just to love us. They come to wake us up, to reveal the parts of ourselves still stuck in fear, to push us toward real emotional growth. And even though that process hurts, it's also sacred, because growth only starts where avoidance ends. The truth is, so many people are starving for real connection while being absolutely terrified of it at the same time. They want intimacy but fear being vulnerable. They want love but fear being abandoned. They want to be understood but hide their real emotions. And that contradiction is at the root of so much human suffering. We build walls thinking they'll protect us, only to realize later that those same walls end up trapping us inside. If a man truly loves you deeply, his distance is rarely as simple as it looks. Underneath it, there's usually longing, fear, confusion, emotional overload, unresolved wounds, and quiet internal battles you may never fully see. That doesn't mean you should chase him endlessly or lose yourself trying to fix him, but it does mean human behavior runs a lot deeper than what shows on the surface. Sometimes the coldest silence is hiding the warmest love. Sometimes the biggest distance is hiding the deepest attachment. And maybe that's what makes love, at its core, both tragic and beautiful all at once. We're all walking around with invisible histories inside us, childhood wounds, old betrayals, heartbreaks we never talk about, insecurities we've never said out loud. And when real love shows up, it touches every one of those hidden places at the same time. Some people rise into courage, others sink into fear. But either way, love shows us exactly who we are underneath the masks we wear for everyone else. One day, a man who spent years running from emotional intensity might finally understand that love was never his enemy, that vulnerability was never weakness, that feeling things deeply was never something to be ashamed of. And when that realization finally lands, he might look back at every moment he pulled away from the people he loved most and finally understand the pain his silence caused. Because avoiding your emotions never actually protects anyone. It just delays the healing that has to happen eventually. The soul was never looking for something surface level. It wants truth. It wants real presence. It wants the courage to be fully seen without having to hide. And the people who actually change our lives are rarely the ones who just entertained us for a while. They're the ones who forced us to face ourselves. The ones who woke up parts of our spirit that had been asleep. The ones who showed us exactly how deeply we're capable of feeling. So if someone once loved you deeply but still kept their distance, don't automatically assume it means you weren't worthy of love. Sometimes you were simply too emotionally significant for a wounded heart to know how to handle. Sometimes your presence woke up feelings he'd spent years burying. Sometimes the connection got so intense psychologically that distance felt easier than being vulnerable. But never forget this last truth. Love reaches its highest form not when two wounded people just keep triggering each other's fears, but when both people choose growth over avoidance. Real love takes courage, the courage to communicate honestly, the courage to stay emotionally present, the courage to stop running from vulnerability, the courage to stay, even when fear is whispering that leaving feels safer. Because in the end, the real tragedy isn't loving someone deeply. The real tragedy is letting fear silence a love that could have changed your entire life. And somewhere out there tonight, there are hearts kept apart, not because love was missing, but because neither person knew how to say it out loud. Souls quietly longing for each other from behind walls built out of old pain. People pretending they feel nothing while secretly carrying oceans inside them. And maybe that's exactly why this message reached you tonight. Not by chance, but because some part of you needed to hear this truth. A man who loves you deeply sometimes keeps his distance because of one thing: an emotional intensity strong enough to stir up both love and fear inside him at the same time. And only the people brave enough to face their own hearts will ever discover that the deepest connections in life were never meant to be run from. They were meant to heal.